Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the January 2025 San Joaquin Valley REAP webinar. This is the 27th webinar over the last 2.5 years or so, and is the last REAP webinar of the program. The program ended last month, actually. So again, we appreciate everybody for their participation throughout the years here. Our last workshop is on residential objective design standards. Excellent study that Ramey and Associates put together for the Valley, and is really a guidebook for planners on how to implement this in your communities. Before we get started, let me just introduce Robert, the co-host of Fresno COG. There he is. And I'll introduce the panelists in a second, but a few house rules. This presentation will be recorded, and the slide deck and the guidebook's already posted on the REAP website, but the slide deck and the recording of the webinar will be made available in a couple of days. I'll get an email out to all the attendees. I'll also provide a post-workshop evaluation, and we appreciate your feedback. This webinar is eligible for AICP CM credit, and I'll get you the course number for that as soon as I get it as well. We prefer to wait till the end to answer questions, but we may take a break, and if there's a natural break throughout the webinar for questions, Robert will be monitoring those. You could raise your hand, you could use the question and answer function, or you could use the chat function, and we'll get back to you. Presentation probably should take about a half hour or so with time for questions. We're looking at an hour of your time, but it may be a little shorter than that, or maybe a little longer. And that's all I have right now. So let's go ahead and start. Simran, why don't you go ahead and introduce Janine and yourself, and take it away.
Thank you, Michael. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I know you all have busy schedules, so we appreciate your time. I'm Simran Malhotra. I'm a principal with Ramey and Associates. We're a planning and urban design firm with offices in Los Angeles and Berkeley, California. As Michael mentioned, our firm was retained to create this guidebook to help local planners implement objective design standards in their community. I have with me Janine Cavalli. She's an associate principal, and she and I will be tag teaming on the presentation today. Before we get started, we have a poll question for you. We just want to get a sense of who's attending today. So if you can answer the question on the screen in front of you. Michael, if most have answered, you can share the results.
1 second, I just want to let everybody have a chance. There's 2 more coming in. All right, share results. Can you see that?
Yes, thank you, Michael. So looks like 3/4 work for local jurisdiction. There are some who are private sector planners, and then there are some in the development community. So welcome, everybody. This just gives us a little context about who the audience is. So thank you. So let's get started. So the presentation is organized in 3 big sections. The first one is just a little bit of background and context for why this guidebook was necessary. Then we jump into the meat of the presentation, which is the contents of the guidebook, how it's organized, and then finally we'll end with how you can use the guidebook in your specific jurisdictions. So to start off, this guidebook lays out a roadmap for how each community can prepare objective design standards that uniquely serve the needs of their community while meeting the state's requirements. This is not a model set of design standards because we strongly believe that each community and jurisdiction is different and they have different and unique needs that that would be addressed in a different manner through objective design standards to best address their needs. In terms of the legal and legal background, objective design standards came into being first in 2017, and I'll talk about that on the next slide in a second. But these are the definition for an objective standard is standards that involve no personal or subjective judgment by a public official. These are usually concise, clear, so that anyone reading these comes away with the same understanding. These are often quantifiable. For example, development standards like height limits, setbacks, etc. Those are objective. In terms of design standards that are objective, an example might be the upper floor of above the third floor, for example, must be set back 5 feet. That's a numeric standard, and it's very clear what that would look like. In general, we have found that switching design guidelines, which have should statements, to shall statements doesn't work. And I'm sure you've all had experience with that in your communities. We can talk about that a little bit more in Q&A as well. In terms of how we got here from the state requirements, in 2017, SB 35 first introduced the requirement for ODS, although it applied only to affordable housing projects. In 2019, SB 330 and changes to the Housing Accountability Act expanded this application to include market rate housing and to mixed use projects. After this date, cities could only adopt objectively written standards, and any subjective guidelines that were available could not be used to deny or reduce the density of a qualified project. Another important element was the mandate to provide certainty and predictability in the review process. And we'll touch on this a little bit later in the presentation. So objective design standards apply to all residential projects with 2 units or more. These include single-family homes, multifamily residential units, as well as mixed use, where 2/3 or more of the square footage is designated for residential use. I will note that just this year, AB 1893 went into effect, which lowers the threshold for mixed-use projects from 2/3 to 50% if at least 500 net new units are being created, and hotel rooms do not count towards that net new number. And with that, I will switch this over to Janine to describe the contents of the guidebook.
Thanks, Simran. So I'm going to speak to some of the primary components that are included in the guidebook. The guidebook is organized into these 4 sections: approaches for objective design standards, the design topics. We include an architectural style guide as an appendix, and then we also include the roadmap to adoption, which is effectively the implementation. And together, this framework will help to create and implement objective design standards in your community. So as I said, I'm going to walk us through the first 3 on the next set of slides before handing it back to Simran, who will review the roadmap to adoption. So now I'm going to get into the common approaches to the objective design standards. So in our guidebook, we have 4 of the more commonly used approaches for creating objective standards. These are listed here: a menu of options, numerical standards, points-based standards, and a checklist. There isn't a one-size-fits-all strategy, and any ODS document may benefit from using any combination of one or more of these strategies. As Simran had mentioned previously, directly rewriting any of this design guidelines by just simply switching out the should statements with shalls is usually not sufficient, as guidelines are often written with subjective or vague terminology, so you may end up with just a subjective standard and not an objective standard. In addition, guidelines, because they can be vague or broad, and standards are typically more narrowly focused, it's usually difficult to translate one single design guideline into a new objective standard. It oftentimes requires multiple standards to address the intent of one more broadly written guideline. So then on this slide, this illustrates for you what some of these different approaches might look like. The top left shows a menu of options whereby the project would only need to meet a subset of a longer set of criteria in order to meet the standard. So in this example, the applicant would pick 2 from a list of 5 design criteria, and that would meet the standard. The top right shows a points-based standard whereby a list of criteria are assigned points, and you need to select from the list to meet the minimum threshold of points. The bottom right is a numerical standard that is a more typical type of standard that uses measurements such as minimum dimensions or percentages. And then lastly is the checklist, which is a structured list of standards that also can serve as a tool for evaluating compliance for that standard. So then this slide shows a summary of the pros and cons of the 4 different approaches that I just described. For example, for the menu of options, that is the more flexible approach, and it allows applicants to select the option that may best fit with their context, though it may not lend itself well to all different types of standards. Numerical is the most straightforward and precise, though it can limit flexibility and design creativity. And oftentimes we find that the applicant will try to just satisfy that minimum criteria instead of going above and beyond. The points-based system is where you can calibrate desirable design elements with a higher value of points, though it can be complicated to set up with considerable discretion in how to allocate those points. And then again, the checklist is also quite straightforward, easy to follow, though it can be more complex more complex design criteria can be difficult to capture in this more simplistic checklist format. And it also doesn't allow for many graphics or photos to be included. One way that we do find that the checklist can be valuable is if it's in addition to the document. So you have your document, which may use menu of options standards, numerical standards, and then you also include a checklist as a simple reference to each standard. Maybe you just reference the name or number, and then it provides the opportunity to confirm compliance with each of those standards as more of an administrative tool. So now we're going to move into the design topics component of the guidebook. And the guidebook is organized into 2 main sections for single-family residential and for multifamily and mixed-use residential. And then the design topics are included for each of those. And within each design topic, they're organized by providing an intent statement, a list of best practices for what the standards should address, and then an example standard with supporting graphics or photos. So here is the list of all of the design topics for the single family residential. And there's 3 broader categories shown in the blue: subdivision, design and circulation, building elements, and site elements. And one thing that we wanted to note is that even though subdivisions typically go through a discretionary review process, we have included standards in the guidebook for a few different reasons. One being that more than 75% of new residential development in the region is single family housing and new subdivisions. Another is 2024, a new Senate bill was adopted that requires local agencies to ministerially approve parcel maps for housing development projects of 10 or fewer units. And that we also heard during a number of the meetings at the outset of this process from planning staff across the region of the specific design topics to demonstrate the types of detailed information that is addressed in the guidebook. So this is an example of one of the design topics within the subdivision design section for block size and connectivity. So summarized here are some of the best practice design criteria for block size, such as maximum block size, and then for connectivity, such as minimizing dead-end streets, aligning streets with adjacent subdivisions, and better connecting neighborhoods to parks, trails, and paths. And then on the right is an example that we've provided in the guidebook that includes sample language and a diagram to illustrate the minimum requirements. And then here's another example for single family within the building elements section. And this is for windows. And the best practice guidance is summarized here, and the blue bullet points for window design, materials, and styles. And the guidebook provides an example standard, again shown on the right, with demonstrating how to recess windows through an illustration, and then also providing some example photos, including photos of what to do and what not to do. So one thing that we highlight in the guidebook is that the design of single-family residential neighborhoods should support a mix of housing types and sizes and affordability. And missing middle housing types, which is a term that refers to a lot of the smaller multi-unit family housing types built prior to World War II, can contribute that affordability and variety of housing. And so the standards included in this guidebook support missing middle housing types. And those types are shown here, including small lot detached housing units, buildings such as duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes that comprise multiple attached units where the building itself takes on a form similar to a single-family home, and then other attached single-family unit types such as cottage clusters and courtyard housing and townhomes. So we recommend that you review your zoning code and make sure that there are zones where these housing types illustrated here are allowed. So one of the other items included in the guidebook is the architectural style guide. And this is to ensure that design elements correspond to a home's architectural style. And we've included it as a reference in the appendix. The 5 styles here were identified during our research in meeting with a number of jurisdictions in the region as the more common styles in the San Joaquin Valley. And this is included in the appendix and as an illustration of what these styles are and their key architectural features, rather than providing specific design criteria. And so that's why they're not included in the main body of the guidebook. And our recommendation is not to require a specific architectural style, but rather when an architectural style is selected, the building is consistent with the character defining features of that style. So here's an example of what's included in the appendix for the modern farmhouse style. So it calls out key features of each style, such as the type and characteristics of the roof, the windows, materials, and other architectural elements characteristic of that style, such as the porch, in this case, porches. And should you choose to address architectural styles in your ODS, this reference will help you craft specific standards related to the styles typically built in your community. So now I'm going to shift to the design topics that are included for multifamily residential. So again, the topics are organized by these blue categories such as pedestrian connectivity, vehicle access and parking, modulation and articulation, ground floor design, and others. Within each are a series of more specific design topics, and that's what's shown in black. And so again, let's take a closer look. We're going to look at the modulation and articulation as an example. So the intent of the modulation and articulation standards is to minimize the scale, massing, and bulk of buildings to respond to the human scale and to the building's context. So within modulation and articulation, there's 5 different subtopics shown in blue. So there's the building and massing breaks, facade design, articulation, corner treatments, and fenestration. The best practice, and then the first of which, the building and massing breaks, we'll go into a little bit more detail. That's what's shown in the example here. The best practices listed here aim to divide the facades into smaller, more human-scaled sections. And then we include the dimensions for maximum building length, the frequency and dimensions of major and minor massing breaks, and the height of the break. And that's what's illustrated. Those standards are illustrated in the graphic on the right. And then there's one more example I'm going to give for multifamily residential, which is for open space. We include design standards for both public open space, like public greens, our plazas, and private open areas like balconies. And this slide shows some of the recommendations specifically for the private areas. So both private common areas like the area with the barbecue and benches shown in the top photo, and private personal open areas like the balcony shown in the bottom photo. And the standards for each address minimum dimensions. So again, back to the approaches, this is the numerical standard approach. So minimum dimensions of the outdoor area, requirements for landscaping, amenities, and screening. And now I'll hand it back to Simran to go over the design review process and implementation.
Thank you, Janine. As I mentioned earlier, the SB 330 and the changes to the Housing Accountability Act also require cities to adopt streamlined and ministerial processes for approval of housing projects. So this table here outlines 4 different ways approvals may occur. Some of these are required and some of these are optional or suggested. So to start off, the first level is staff level approval, and this is required for SB 35 projects. So if a project meets all objective standards, then ministerial approval at staff level is required by state law. This is also a process jurisdictions may adopt for SB 330 eligible projects if they so wish, but it is not required. The second level is allowing some discretion at the staff level for exceptions to the ODS. So we often see cities allowing a 10% to some standards of variation at a staff level without having to go through a variance process or a discretionary review process. This is only for limited and predefined exceptions, and it's optionally available for SB 330 projects. Some cities still require a design review committee or a planning commission or city council to approve all SB 330 qualified projects, and that's certainly allowed. There are 2 caveats. One is that those decision-making bodies may not deny or reduce the density of a project if it meets all objective standards, so the discretion is limited. And secondly, there is a 5 hearing limit to the number of public meetings that can occur under SB 330. The final option, which is a discretionary review, is only available to projects that are not eligible for streamlining. This also includes projects that are looking for any kind of changes to the general plan or zoning code, or are not able to or want to meet the objective standards as written. So applicants in those cases may choose to pursue a discretionary review path. Plan developments would also fall under that criteria. The diagram shown here graphically lays out an example of a design approval pathway for projects that do not require any legislative action and comply with the zoning and general plan requirements. Moving on to how do jurisdictions go about adopting objective design standards for their communities. And the guidebook outlines 6 steps that a community should take, and I'll go over these in the following slides. The first step, involves understanding the design topics that are of the greatest importance to your community. The guidebook has laid out an extensive list of topics that could be of concern, but not every topic is relevant to every community in the San Joaquin Valley. So the first step involves community-wide conversations or discussions with the development and design communities and the decision makers as to what are the most important topics that the ODS in your community should address. The second step, know your code, involves reviewing the code to see how and if and how these design topics are addressed, and to look for potential issues, inconsistencies, or conflicts with state law. This step may eventually require changes to your code, especially if you're looking to allow for the missing middle housing, which are often not allowed for the way most zoning codes are written. Step 3 is pick your approach, and this refers to the different ways standards can be written. Janine had described these earlier. These include menu-based and numerical approaches. Step 4 involves selecting the design topics from the guidebook that were identified in step 1, and then crafting standards based on the best practices and considerations included in the guidebook. Steps 2 and 4 can be an iterative process, as you'll need to continually refer back to zoning to confirm that there are no conflicts. We also recommend reviewing recently approved or denied projects against the topics you have identified to see how the standards you have drafted might address a project that's already been approved. Step 5 includes confirming that your design review process is consistent with state law. This may again require amendments to your zoning code. And lastly, we draft and adopt the objective design standards. And there are 2 ways to you can adopt the standards, which are summarized on the following slide. These include you can adopt either by resolution or ordinance, and these can be standalone or incorporated into your zoning code. There are pros and cons for both. An ordinance is a little more challenging process, requires a second reading and a 30-day effective waiting period before they go into effect. If incorporated in the zoning code, also allows for the development and design standards to reside together, but changes end up being a little bit more difficult and most online zoning code formats don't allow for a lot of graphics, so that can sometimes be a challenge. A resolution is easier to adopt and amend over time, and can also include design guidelines that apply only to discretionary projects. And certainly the layout and the graphic friendly format works easier if it's a standalone document. I will go back to this slide. The last piece I'd like to mention is in order to be able to develop ODS for your community, we put together an evaluation tool. It is included in the appendix of the document and will also be available as an Excel sheet on the project website after in the next couple of days, as Michael mentioned. And it is intended to guide planners through the first 4 steps in the process of selecting standards for your community. So there are 2 worksheets. One is for single family residential, and the second is for multifamily residential. And these involve the first 4 steps: prioritizing, checking it against your code, picking your approach, and then crafting your standards. And with that, we would like to answer any questions you might have. Here's a link for where the guidebook is available, and I will stop sharing so we can get to the Q&A.
Okay, so we do have one question in the queue. If a developer chooses not to comply with the jurisdiction's objective design standards, could a discretionary grant permit, a CUP or variance, be a way out? On what grounds could a jurisdiction recommend supporting or denying the request?
So if I understand correctly, if an applicant chooses not to follow the objective design standards, that's entirely available to them. What that means is their project may not get approved by the decision-making body. That discretion, it would be available to them. Sometimes and then there's a little bit of a trade-off back and forth with the applicant as to what the staff would support and what the decision makers would approve. Certainly a CUP process would be available. If a plan development process is used, again, there's a lot more discretion available to the decision makers at that time to before they approve or deny a project.
Okay. The next question, thank you for the presentation. Is there any guidance on how to handle standards for historic districts and historic designated properties?
That's a really good question. Historic properties and historically designated districts usually are covered by the Secretary of Interior standards in terms of the actual modifications to those buildings. So I would certainly recommend that those continue to be followed. Cities can adopt more specific guidance depending on the architectural styles that are prevalent in those historic districts as to what they might allow. Typically, those are fairly detailed and would also need to be consistent with the Secretary of Interior standards, as I mentioned earlier.
Okay, at this time, I have no other questions. Please do feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A, preferably, or in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, we can unmute you. You can ask your question live.
Simran, what percentage of the Valley jurisdictions on your survey in the report did you find had objective design standards already?
I think it was a fairly small number. I believe it was in the 15 to 20% range. So of the 70 jurisdictions, probably between 15 and 20
All right.
had objective design standards. What we also found was that, and several of those 15 or 20 jurisdictions had, right when SB 330 went into effect, they adopted some standards to be in compliance, but were looking to augment those and having used the standards they had for a while to revise them to better fit the needs of their community.
Simran, what, in your experience, what has been the, for those areas that do have ODS, common, I mean, that is to say, for those that have had it for a while or, at least for some period of time, what has been the development community's reaction in your experience?
That's a good question. We've had, as you might expect, two sets of reactions. One is at the outset, the development community doesn't want restrictions, right? They want to be able to build what they can, what the market bears, and what they would like to build. So we have seen that. We've heard that pushback, especially at the outset. At the flip side, once these go into effect, and in some of the communities where after having used these for a while, the clarity and certainty of the design review process is much appreciated, because as far as the development community is concerned, time is money. So getting a project through approved quickly is really important. So going back to some of the opposition we've heard, often it's tied to some of the details of the building elements that we are proposing. Some of these design details do cost more. On the flip side, they do create for better buildings that last longer and contribute in a more productive manner to the placemaking of a community.
And if I could add to your answer, Simran, I think one of the areas where there is kind of a good balance is using the menu of options, because that still allows for the element of choice and selecting from a list that the city is comfortable with, but still allowing for some sort of choice.
Yeah, that's a good point, Janine. And it also prevents you from getting cookie cutter projects where everything looks the same, because every project is different. The designers have a choice of which element they pick, so which results in a broader variety of the types of buildings that get built.
And it's probably too early for this, but I'm just curious, have we seen any impact in terms of development authorization or, the development progress as the result of this? Has development, do we know whether development has picked up or slowed down generally as the result of this, or is it too early to tell?
To be honest, I think objective design standards have not had that much impact on what gets built. Certainly SB 35 projects have really hastened the construction of new housing, especially those that contain affordable housings across the state. Usually the market is more of a determinant as to when projects get built. Objective standards, while important, in my opinion, have a more limited role.
Thank you very much.
Okay, last call. Any questions? Okay, well, Simran and Janine from Ramey, thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation. So good that we don't have that many questions, so that's always a good thing. We appreciate again everybody for joining us, and we'll meet you on some other path in life outside of REAP for the San Joaquin Valley.
Going
So,
out with a bang. It's a nice group today. Thank you for
yeah,
joining us.
yep. All right. Have a good
Thank
week,
you.
everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Simran. Thank you, Janine. Take care. Bye-bye.